Good evening, good evening, good evening, and welcome to Healing Higher Education, Race, Reckoning, and Reimagining, our second conversation in the series. My name is David Robinson Morris. I'm the Executive Director of CMind, and I'm so happy to welcome you here this evening. We'll begin with a brief practice. Wherever you find yourselves in the world, find a comfortable spot, a comfortable posture. Feet on the ground, hands relaxed. Take a deep breath in. Take in the deepest breath you have taken all day. Exhale. Deep breath. Exhale. You are here. Follow the rhythm of your breath. Notice in gratitude how your chest rises and falls out of love for you. You are here. Focus on your ears and open your heart. Let's feast on these words from Lucille Clifton. Won't you celebrate with me what I have shaped into a kind of life? I had no model. Born in Babylon, both non-white and woman, what did I see to be except myself? I made it up. Here on this bridge between starshine and clay. My one hand holding tight my other hand. Come celebrate with me that every day, something has tried to kill me and has failed. Come celebrate with me that every day, something has tried to kill me and has failed. Thank your body for keeping you. Thank your spirit for sustaining you. Thank whatever gods may be for your being here. Breathing in deeply and exhaling. Breathing in deeply and exhaling. Breathing in deeply and exhaling. ASHE. Thank you. Thank you. Good evening and welcome again to the second conversation in our Healing Higher Education series titled Embodying the Institution, Healing the Faculty. Again, my name is David Robinson Morris, and I'm pleased to serve as the Executive Director in service to the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society, more commonly known as CMind. The Center for Contemplative Mind and Society is a global community of practitioners and scholars working at the intersection of contemplative justice and higher education to inspire, to engage, and to support the integration of contemplative practices and understandings in our everyday living toward the development of a more just world, a deepened understanding of our shared humanity, our responsibility to the planet, and the production of new knowledges. CMind convenes conferences, we organize seminars and lectures, we facilitate workshops, and form communities of practice with relevant experts, scholars, and practitioners with diverse interests and backgrounds. We envision ourselves as a conduit of individual, collective, systemic, and institutional transformation, where society is transformed through active engagement in contemplative practices and understandings. These active engagements make possible radical healing, human flourishing, and collective liberation. We envision institutions of higher learning and a society that practices compassion, pursues justice, and acts in ways that honor our shared humanity. Tonight's program, like the program before it in this series, is just a small glimpse of the work we are endeavoring to do to make radical healing, human flourishing, and collective liberation possible for us all. Tonight's conversation is deeply important for a number of reasons. The last decade has revealed two conflicting realities in the educational sector. First, students within higher education institutions are suffering from an empathy deficit. Reports from UCLA's annual freshman survey in 2017 revealed that levels of compassion and empathy among college students was at their lowest levels in 30 years. Second, compassion fatigue has overwhelmed educators during the pandemic, resulting in secondary trauma and work-related burnouts, which we are now calling the Great Resignation. These seemingly conflicting realities are interconnected byproducts of the same problem: the system's lack of capacity to care and practice compassion. In my opinion, the educative endeavor through the acquisition and production of new knowledge should be a process of deepening our understanding of what it means to be a human being in relationship with other human beings, with nature and the planet. However, as I've said over and over again and written, today's universities are market-driven institutions comprised of siloed epistemological sub-regimes characterized by fear. Fear of the market, fear of the government, and fear of the students they were created to educate. Institutions of higher education operate in ways dictated by the market for the sake of its own survival. They have become suppliers in an environment driven by consumer demand, what Michael Apple calls an educational supermarket. Faculty and staff are the university. We are the engines that power the system. Contrary to popular belief, education is not a supermarket. Students are not consumers making unfathomable demands of faculty, and faculty are not the worker bees of the system driven by outrageously out-of-touch bosses focused on productivity. Yet it seems this is where we find ourselves today. Just this morning, I read a story in the Washington Post whose heading proclaimed colleges scramble to recruit students as nationwide enrollment plunges. The article reads, quote, "The National Student Clearinghouse Research Center, which produced the National Estimate of Enrollment Decline, found acute troubles in several states since fall 2019. In Pennsylvania, for instance, public university enrollment fell 12% and community college enrollment plunged 23%. The word faculty is only mentioned 3 times in the entire article. 3 times. Tonight, we'll talk about healing. Healing for faculty. Perhaps to heal in the academy is to take up an alternative subject positionality as a subversive radical, as a subversive intellectual, or to understand the words of Fred Moden in the Undercommon's Fugitivity in Black Study. Fred Moden writes, "After all, the subversive intellectual came under false pretenses, with bad documents, out of love." Let me read that again. The subversive intellectual came to the academy under false pretenses, with bad documents and out of love. Her labor is as necessary as it is unwelcome. The university needs what she bears, but cannot bear what she brings. And on top of all that, she disappears. She, he, they perhaps disappear not into obscurity, but into wholeness. They disappear into the freedom born of understanding oneself and the world differently. Perhaps they disappear into doing what they know how to do and not giving a damn who likes or dislikes it. Perhaps they disappear into healing or the battle to become whole, to reconcile our current reality with our past traumas, our past joys and wounds from our present and future wholeness, for balance and for coming home to ourselves. Healing is a practice, a continuous practice and process. Healing systems is a continuous process of embodiment, of making incarnate the transformation toward wholeness and compassion within ourselves first, so that this attunement in body, mind, and spirit alters every environment in which you might find yourselves planted. However, nothing can be healed until it is faced, and nothing is faced in earnest until we all tell the truth about it. The central question of this entire series is this: given the current state of higher education, how might we catalyze a healing to transform higher ed into what it is not yet, but must become if we are to live together peacefully, respect the planet, and uplift the human spirit? Tonight, we discuss the role of faculty in healing and embodying the institution. Our guests will shed light on what faculty are experiencing on campuses across the country amid the pandemic, their perspectives on their own woundedness and that of their students in this moment of racial reckoning and grand transformation. And finally, we will engage our imaginations to envision what healing might look like, what it might feel like, what it might be like on campuses across the country. Tonight, we talk about reclaiming ourselves in a system that every day has tried to kill us, but we survive. Now, please allow me to introduce tonight's dynamic guest. Most of you, if you're part of CMind, already know Dr. Abu Gundy. Dr. Abu Gundy is a memory keeper, ancestral priest, and full spectrum doula. Her creative works and research are grounded in African-centered contemplative and ritual practices that center joy and love to heal intergenerational trauma. She's interested in transforming the academy into one of many paths of contemplative practice. Dr. Abu Gundy is a faculty member in African American and African Diaspora Studies at Indiana University. Dr. Ricardo Montelongo, who is new to our wonderful community, is an associate professor in the Department of Educational Leadership at Sam Houston State University. He teaches in the higher ed administration, higher education leadership, and developmental education administration programs. Ricardo's primary interests include college student involvement, the impact of Latina, Latino, Latinx college student organizations, diversity issues in higher education, and spirituality in higher education. He also studies critical digital pedagogy and online teaching and learning. Welcome, Ricardo and Dr. Abu Gundy. I'll now turn the floor over to you, Ricardo, to tell us a bit about yourself and to give your opening remarks.
Great, thank you, David. Greetings, everyone. I come to you from the state of Texas, and I am very excited to be part of this discussion that we're going to have tonight. Other than my bio, which David just read, a little bit about me. He mentioned one of my areas of research, which is spirituality in higher ed. There'll probably be moments within tonight's discussion that I'll go further into that, but that is a new part of my research agenda and my scholar identity. I say that because it's always been a part of me in my own personal identity. But as a tenured faculty member, as someone who did earn tenure during the pandemic, I really did have a self-reflective moment where I had to ask myself, what was all of this for? And especially during the time of world pain and suffering, was getting tenure just a moment of celebration, or was there something deeper to that? And so I did a lot of reflection, and that is why I am now, a large part of my current research has drifted away from that, from the initial areas that he mentioned, but is now, I have a very large focus on what we'll be talking about tonight and the issue of spirituality. But in addition to that, I live in Houston, Texas, near the Johnson Space Center, which for me is fantastic because I consider myself a space geek. And so I'm glad to be in this part of Houston. And my hobbies, I enjoy running and anything involving food and the kitchen. And that is part of my sort of identity. I love to host. I love hospitality. And that is me, both in the academic and personal sense.
Thank you, Rick. Dr. Abegunde.
Oh, good evening, amazing beings. I am so glad that so many of you opted to spend this evening with us. There's so many other things that you could be doing, so I want to welcome you. I am, David, what you said about subversiveness in the academy, I went in search of a poem, so I'm going to introduce myself in this manner. And it is a poem that I wrote after, in fact, a faculty party. And so this will, I think, tell you a little bit about me and how I respond to things, but where it is that we sit, particularly for Black women in the academy. So at the faculty party, he tried to tell me who I was with that ending day. Your name could be French or something Latin. I smiled, still savoring my response to the question before his pronouncement. Had slavery been 500 years shorter? He expects my discomfort to turn into laughter, the kind women give when they swallow their anger, the kind they later tell themselves was the best they could do, lest they be perceived as ungoverned, unruly, Black. My name, it is Yoruba. I refuse to look away. It means one born during the time of the ancestors, or one with whom the ancestors come. I do not ask him what his one syllable name means. I do not care. He wants me to care, but I do not. It could also mean I continue as I lean slowly over him. I was tired of his mouth in my face, his hair close to my eyes. I was tired of him. It could also mean, if you don't know Yoruba or the many words that make my name one, the ancestor who cuts with the knife. I want to say machete, want to tell him that I am she who draws blood before I cut you, she who does not laugh or gossip, who did not learn girly things because once, well, my father said I was born a wise woman and I was never a girl. I want to tell him what my friends say. If ever I have to cut off your head, you will be grateful because only when I hand it to you, you will understand that you are receiving a gift. The Yoruba who meet me sometimes say, why did you take that name? Your name is for a boy. Your name is for those who work with the dead. Why don't you change it? I say, Abegunde. It means me and my dead get along just fine. It means that I am blacker than 1,000 midnights. Even the dark is afraid of me. And so when you said that about the subversive, the question, however, that answer, had slavery been 500 years shorter, the question that I was asked was, why is the name of your department so long? And so I went home and I thought about it. And my immediate response was that much to the concern of other people who were there. I am a non-tenured faculty member and just switching positions in my department after founding the Graduate Mentoring Center on my campus and just resigning from that position to take the full-time position in my department. And I just want to say, I come to CMind and I am dedicated to CMind because of these dialogues. And I am dedicated to this particular kind of work because what CMind does for us and what it offers in the academy is an opportunity to really think about our inner lives, right? This commitment to reflection, what Kevin Quashie would say is studying our inner lives. We spent the day today reading Lucille Clifton and Black Aliveness by Kevin Quashie. And so CMind for me and this work that we're doing, these dialogues, is about something that is dear to me as a form of embodiment of being in the university, that our entire beings become, right? Not acts of resistance, but to really fully embody who we are as beings and letting that be literally the machete that cuts through. Right. And recognizing that everyone can't do that all the time everywhere. So how do we create a place where we can come in and out of it, right? Every revolution needs cookie bakers. Right? So I will stop there.
My word. All right. I think the night's over. Everyone have a good time. No, I'm kidding. That's wonderful, right? Every revolution needs a different thing. And what we know about revolutions, right, is that they all spring from love, right? Love of a thing, of a people, of a place. And even when we begin to talk about the institution known as higher education, right? As Fred Moten says, we came to it with bad papers out of love, right? Which means that if we love it and we want it to continue differently, then we have to transform it. Right. So I want us to talk about one. We got this question last time, right? What assumptions are being made that higher ed needs to be healed or that faculty need to be healed? Let's talk about a little bit about around that, right? Do faculty need to be healed? If so, why? Does the institution need to be healed? If so, why?
I'll go ahead and start with my thoughts on that. In terms of the institution, if they need to be healed, like I said, one of my most important moments of my professional career occurred at a time where many of us were confused. Many of us were going through pain, and many of us quite literally was trying to stay alive. And it was interesting to note that at that same time, I was experiencing 10 years lifelong employment. How does my institution see that when, quite honestly, they may be putting us at risk to you mentioned in your poem, what is trying to kill us today, which was a very, very powerful, very, very powerful statement to begin. But I started reflecting on why is our specific institution creating that culture, that sense of, in order to be a member of our community, you pretty much do what we tell you to do. And so in terms of healing, I started hearing my colleagues starting to wonder, is this really where we want to be? And is this what's going to continue? And so just for me personally, the way I try to define the aspect of healing, it starts first with me to know that if I can try to make an impact just on my own, to try to create a ripple, as they say, to create that change, I have to be patient with myself. And so, but I have to understand where I am at this current moment. And so I see healing as, with me trying to create that change in the institution by trying to have others see how I act, how I respond to difficult challenges, and to create that community, to create that communication to where we can start to understand where we're at the moment. And a large part of that comes, and I didn't add this to my professional or my introduction. Part of my journey at this moment has been to study Benedictine philosophy and to become an oblate novice for a monastic community. And part of that is related to not only my personal journey and my personal journey of healing, but using that new identity to try to heal others and to hear the wisdom I hear from my monastic brothers to, again, try to understand where we're at.
Thank you. Do faculty and do institutions need to heal? I guess my question is, do they want to be healed? Right. In my capacity as a priest and a healing facilitator and healer, that's the question always for me is, do you want to be healed? And one of the questions that I have asked publicly at my institution during all of our listening sessions after in June 2020 is, what are people willing to do to divest themselves of the particular white supremacists and other types of paradigms in which they live? And so there's that question. But there is a need for healing. We've been talking a lot about healing in my memory trauma and healing class and asking people to define that, and thinking about healing as a way that we address, not necessarily confront aggressively, but that we address. We do not pretend that we are blind to or invisible to the wounds that are being created continuously. And so also, who is responsible for addressing that? So there is a need for that, but at the individual level and at the institutional level, that has to be determined also, that there is a want. And because I think the need produces, as was produced, and that's a deliberate choice in words, as was produced these past 2 years, reactions to, without thought. I like to tell people I am a child of Ella Baker, and Ella Baker is to say that if white people wanted to, they could end racism. And so, but there has to be some thought that goes into that too, because even in that decision, there has to be some consideration about what needs to be taken in, what needs to be released, what needs to let go. But I imagine that if we did this all together, that we actually do not have to be naked or hungry or lonely if we also make some decisions about that. So yes, there's a need, but the question is, do you want to, right? Tony Cade Bombada, do you want to be well? Are you sure, sweetheart, that you want to be well? Because being well comes with a weight of responsibility. And I don't necessarily think at this moment that as a whole, right, people are ready to think about the responsibility of being well and of healing in that very large way, but in a micro way, yes.
Yeah. Wow. So to pull in Tony K. Bombara, that's healing, wellness, wholeness is a responsibility, right? And that question that you and Rick got at from different angles, right? Is there a want to be healed, whole, and well within the institution, within the system, within the academy? And those are personal First, they are personal decisions, right? But before I go down that road, because that's a road we're going to go down. We're going to go down, how do you get to that personal decision? Tell me about, and I'll frame it this way, as a former faculty member, full-time sort of faculty member at an institution, now an adjunct, I have faculty friends all over the country who I talk to often, and they tell me about the hell they're catching on their campuses because they feel they are not being seen as human beings, especially in this moment of death and dying and racial reckoning, right? They're being looked at as machines or as tools of a system. Can the two of you talk about if you know of any of your own experiences as faculty members on your respective campuses?
I'll start this time since Rick, but I want to say, because I really do need to say that I'm really excited about being here with Rick, because in our conversations, we found that we were both IU alum, and so there's just a lot of, just before we even started this, a lot of love and appreciation. And so when you asked this question before, I always said that I can't speak for everybody or anybody but myself. But my position on campus in the past 7 years has given me some insight into conversations. And so what I have noticed across campuses, what I have noticed is an exhaustion that cannot be lifted. And because the academy often requires a production in order to stay or to keep your place, that exhaustion cannot be addressed in any way. And so that people are depleted, no matter how it is that they try to address it. There's not enough rest possible. In the past 2 years in particular, what I've also seen is faculty really going out of their way to meet the needs of students, while at the same time meeting their own needs and the needs of their families and community. And that in itself is depleting, because I think the past 2 years, there hasn't been a reserve. There hasn't, and if you had a reserve, that it was very quickly gone by July 5th. 2020, right? And so all of those little games that they had, like you had to fill out a little questionnaire, like when would you give in or cave into the pandemic? I think that that's there. And I also see, particularly for faculty of color, the expectations have not changed, but they have increased because students need, right? Students need, and I think it's one of the first times that I've seen where the faculty, students, staff, everyone are holding similar places with family who are ill or struggling themselves to create. We can't ask our students to create assignments or finish assignments if we can't finish our own. So I'll stop there and then come back to my own experience.
One of the things that I have been reflecting on, especially with a question like that, is, in my previous life, before a faculty member, I worked in higher education student affairs. I can't remember the years, so about over 20 years worth in the field, and I worked in the areas of student success. My spouse, my partner, used to work in higher ed. And one of the reasons for that transition is probably related to this question. And so one of the things that I have done is to talk to my fellow colleagues in higher education student affairs to consider that question, but not to ask that question directly. And so one of the ways that I've done that, and again, this is part of my new branch of research and interest, is I talked to people that did pilgrimages. And I spoke specifically to higher education student affairs professionals who have done a pilgrimage or a journey. And I specifically selected the Camino de Santiago in northern Spain, because that seems to be, especially since the mid 80s, something that a lot of people know because there's a movie about it, but in other areas as well. And so I found it fascinating to speak to these people, even though some were faculty, some were not, but collectively, they gave these interesting insights on our current world in higher ed. And one of the things, as someone who teaches quite often organization theory, organization behavior, higher education, we're stuck in this model of everything has to be described in these metaphors, metaphors like it's a jungle, it's bureaucratic and things like that. And in the course of talking to these individuals who did pilgrimages, they use metaphors to talk about what's wrong in higher ed, which I think faculty can definitely connect to. We've become factory performance models. We've become mechanical. We are an engine that rarely works. But despite that, these folks stayed in higher ed. And so one of the things that I think we should reflect on is and how higher education, how we're going to do this, is this idea of giving faculty members just time to pause. We are constantly asked to be on the go. Even the Trinity, service, research, and teaching, it's sometimes some days it's like happening all at once within the hour. And one of the lessons I learned from these individuals that I talked that did pilgrimages, the pilgrimage allowed them to understand the importance of pausing, and they have included it in their practice. And so I think institutions really have to really look at their culture and the cultural behaviors, and is pausing valued? If not, then that's a problem, because if we don't have pausing, we have what you call the Great Resignation.
I want to say also, thank you so much, Rick. I also want to note Desiree Aspiras and her comment there about being over capacity, but also showing up for students, and that it makes a difference. And it does make a difference. Thank you so very much for that. The pausing is absolutely important. One of the things someone said to me once, that if you saw them stop on campus for a few minutes, it was because of the practices that I had taught and asked people to do at the Graduate Mentoring Center. And so one of the things that it is hard to do at this moment is also to become accustomed to doing nothing, that cessation. It's very difficult. And as we're coming out of the past 2 years, I try to also remind people that for many people of color, this was an amp up, but it was not necessarily a large change, right? And depending on where you are in the world. And so for me, because I try to incorporate as a regular practice, stopping. I open up my classes with a short meditation and breathing. We will change assignments if necessary. We will stop and integrate all of the emotional aspects of the course that I am teaching. And I will also ask people to breathe, even as if I don't know you on the street, because it is a way for us to remember that we are beings. We've having a lot of conversation whether or not we want to remain human or still call ourselves human and those types of things, but that we are beings present with each other and in relationship, right? In relationship with one another, not transactional, but relationship. And what does it mean to be in relationship with each other at this time? And, I will say that there are a few times during the past 2 years that I was overwhelmed. And I think because I have such a built-in boundary against that, but I also had community, like my Bloomington community showed up with bread and chocolate and all these types of things because we were conscious of the need to say no. that I'm not going to work more than this? What are the consequences? The consequences are that my body fails. The consequences are that I cannot show up even 75% for my students. The consequences are that, in fact, that I cannot create. And are those consequences worth anything else, right?
If I could respond to that, that's excellent perspective, and I'm glad the Bloomington community showed up for you as well. One of the things that I talked to some honor students last night, and we talked about this particular topic, because as honor students, undergraduate honor students, they get that message of constantly being on the go, 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 go. I can only be high achieving if I'm studying until 4 a.m. in the morning, and then I have to wake up at 8 a.m., things like that. And so it was interesting because, again, I try to emulate my lessons in my teaching. In this 3-hour lecture that I gave, it was sort of like an experiment for me to practice what I want to do more in my teaching and to have my students experience. We talked about the experience of pausing and taking a break, but we also I lost my train of thought, but talking about how that fits in their scholar identity, and how they are going to, in their future, how are they going to add that as part of their collective identity as honor students, and just personally. It was really interesting to hear how they responded to, like, just taking breaks. And I feel like, even the honors, well, I'm not pinpointing my institutions, but just students, and how we as faculty, sometimes we're giving those messages to our students, but when they hear messages like, hey, it's okay to just, stop. Again, it's like, wow, that's something new, or how can I do that? If I think about the thing that I was thinking about, I'll come back to it. But it was interesting to talk to undergraduates yesterday about this.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting point, right? How do we untangle ourselves?
I remember what I said just real quick, because this is from my lessons as an Oblate novice for a Benedictine monastery. We really focused on this quote, and I learned this from some of my teachers at the monastery. Think about this: the difference between the two phrases of work is life versus life is work. And I asked the students, like, how do you understand that? Which one do you see yourself in now, and where do you want to be? And it really kind of confused them, and they finally got it that life isn't work, but you should work on your life. And that's, I think, is a nice little motto to try to practice, in that you should be, well, I got it backwards. Work shouldn't be your life, but your life should be the work that you're doing. You should focus on life, not work.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Rick. By both of your comments, I'm struck by the question, and I deal with this. I'm very open about therapy. I deal with this in therapy all the time, right? How do we, those of us who are in the academy in some way, are high achievers. And sometimes our identities are so intertwined with achieving, right? That we don't know how to untangle that, which could be a product of not being able to be still, right? What do we achieve by being still is that question. I'm also thinking about honor students, right, Rick, that you just brought up, and how this whole system is set up on achievement and exceptionalism, right? And to keep producing more and better every time to maintain the position. And what if we gave that up? There's no question in there, but the thought is, how do we untangle ourselves from this thing? And how do we sit in the grace of becoming? Just the grace of becoming.
I think for me, and I'm looking at the chat, one of the things in the past 2 years from being on Zoom for so long that I have literally learned how to multitask on the screen that I have. And so I'm paying attention to the chat and the questions here. And Shiv Talwar, yes, please. I accept your invitation. Paul Eaton says that it is it's hard, the guilt and shame associated with even taking a night or a day off, right? And so a number of faculty experience that. I think we're talking about this within the context of the academy, but one of the things that is so extremely important to me, and why I said my Bloomington community, those are colleagues and friends within the academy who live here, but who have also made a commitment to have a life outside of the academy, right? And so one of the ways I think in going about this for me that has been really important is about the community. Like my home community is not in Bloomington, right? And so I'm building a community here, but my home community is who checks in with me, who will drive 5 or 6 hours to come and see me, to send me things. Like we do this for each other. And so one of the things that I developed, like just a sheet for students to think about is what is the meaning of community? What do they need from the community? And I do invite people to answer these questions. What do you need? When students ask me, like, how do you, as a student of color, how do you survive and thrive at a PWI? And I was like, well, that's the wrong question. Like, that's not the question that I want you to answer. What I want you to answer is I want you to answer, what does it mean to love? What will bring you love? And then simple things like, what must you be able to see within or get to within 20 minutes, right? Like if you can't be landlocked, like Indiana's landlocked and I'm a child of the Caribbean, right? But if you can live with those questions and ask them, you actually, I believe, can move towards understanding what is going to feed and nurture you. And I always want people to remember that there are choices, right? We don't necessarily all have the best choices. It's the consequences we also need to think through. Right. And so that is the other thing, right? And as we're pondering this, because we talk about the academy as if in the academy that our colleagues and friends and students don't bring their community with them. I teach in Black studies. I have students who don't have really necessarily good thoughts and didn't grow up with good thoughts about Black people. They bring it into the academy with them, right? We live in communities. And so how do we understand ourselves, not as solely this institution, right? But as an entity, a being within a community, to begin understanding that when our students leave us, right? Us, like, sometimes we're the family, but when the students leave, they're going into the world, into the community, right? When our colleagues go home, they're going to community. They may be going to older parents, they may be going to, their children. So I want us to begin thinking about this and unlearning this idea of we're the academy, right? But how do we see ourselves? Because if we spend all this amount of money and time on research, right, to develop the world, this is how I feel about like all of the things in the past 2 years. Like I feel, that we've done all of this work, we've had all of these racial reckoning, we've done all of this work, but you know what? We still have to have these conversations. I want not to have the conversation in 50 years. I don't want to have it in 10 years, right? I mean, this is the thing. So how do we begin to unlearn this idea that we are separate from, that we're doing this work in these little, as Ricardo said, these metaphors, right? Doing it in these little test tubes. And then we go out and that's not what's happening. That's not what happens when you go out and you do research. You are engaging with communities. You're engaging with human beings. You're engaging with their lives and their experience. And they, in fact, are, as the students would say, they're reading and engaging you.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Mm. Yeah. How do we sit? How do we do that in real ways, right? I'm thinking about my own research that was done in community with all that was seen and unseen around combining Ubuntu and Buddhism in higher education, where it does just that, right? It says this is a part of a whole community that is part of a whole community that is part of a whole community that is part of a planetary ecosystem, and that none of us, no matter how we may want to be, are in this thing alone, right? And in fact, each day we are forming each other in relationship, good, bad, ugly, or indifferent. Those things are very important, but the system in and of itself doesn't see itself that way. And part of the reason why this conversation is so important is because I want to stop talking about the system, and I want to start talking about the people who inhabit it and who are it, who embody it, and who have the ability to transform it, right? My opening remarks are around faculty and staff being the institution. If you don't like the shit, you can change it by changing yourselves first, right? Which is the point that both of you are getting at. And by modeling it for our students who will become the future doctor, lawyers, leaders of this planet, right? I'm with you, Abu Gundy. I don't want to be having this conversation in 5 years. Now, do I think I'm going to have it? Yes, because people are stubborn and they're ignorant. However, my heart's hope is that in my lifetime, we will not have to have this conversation. Right at some point before I take my last breath, that this conversation will cease to be a conversation that we need to continue to have to move forward. I want to ask, I'm going to ask Paul Eden's question. I'm going to jump off our timeline here. Paul Eden, Dr. Paul Eden is a good friend of Ricardo and I. And he says, Dr. Robinson Morris often talks about love as the foundation of revolution and healing. But love is a complicated word in higher education. How do the panelists think about the breadth and depth of love in higher education practice, pedagogy, and praxis? It's a big question, Pauline.
Very big question. I know. Thank you, colleague, Dr. Peaton. Glad that you're on the call. Yes, love is a complicated word in our world of higher education. How did the panelists think about the breadth and depth of love in higher education practice, pedagogy, and praxis? I'm looking at specifically, let me focus on practice, because in my way of expressing love, I do it in ways that are very subtle, but to me, it's very intentional. One of the things that was mentioned in my bio was online teaching and learning. And so we all have experiences with online teaching and learning. So we need to remember that part of our roles as faculty and how we use the digital environment to talk about this topic. And so one of the ways that I express love to my students in that space is to think about what they need in that space that is quite frequently by students seen as very anonymous, and I could just get away with, just checking in or whatever. And so I would make like videos, and they would see my voice, and then I would tell them like, some of the things that we mentioned quite briefly in this conversation. Let me know, reach out to me if you need an extension. Reach out to me, send me an email if you need an extension. There's no penalty attached to that. And I always add that. In communications on emails, I never start an email with, hello, the assignment for whatever, ... I always intentionally put a sentence. I usually do, and like Dr. Eaton, I know he uses multiple greetings. I usually do a phrase like, hello, good day. Isn't the weather beautiful today? I hope that you in the Houston area are experiencing, you know, a nice spring day. And so I intentionally try to do these subtle ways of telling my students that I am not just a robot in this digital space. I am someone that is trying to care for you. And that is in a way a form of love, because you are in a way telling students that I don't see you as an anonymous little, you know, circle profile picture in my space. I see you first as a human in my class and not in this, you know, a digital avatar. Students at least tell me that they appreciate sort of the interaction that at least create and the engagement. That's just some short examples. I guess part of me is like, don't overthink it too much. Think about ways that you want to be valued as a human, and specifically in the digital space and the online LMS, and figure out ways to let students know that you are someone who, guess what, you're human too. Talk about the weather. You know, tell them to go take a walk in the woods and things like that. Sometimes they do appreciate that.
Absolutely. One year, during a really bad winter, I canceled my class. And when I walked in the next day, a student said, "You really do love us, don't you?" Like, of course I do. And yes, love for various and sundry reasons, that idea in the academy is complicated, but I don't find it complicated. I think that on a day-to-day basis on our campuses, that we must be willing to speak. So I come from a culture, you know, many of us may come from cultures that if I speak to you and you do not acknowledge me, that's either going to mean we're going to have some words or some conversation about that, right? It's rude, you know, when I'm home in Brazil, even a stranger to say hello and to not respond. What I tell my students the first day is that you are going to spend the next 16 weeks with me. I'm the only person on campus who looks like I do. That is, I wear a gele. I'm a visibly African practicing person, among other things. If after 16 weeks you pass me on the street and you do not say hello and I say hello to you, do not ever ask me for a recommendation. I'm really clear about that. And so we talk about why I say that. And I explain to them that our work in the world is to acknowledge each other's presence and to be willing to extend compassion to each other, and to be willing, as Ricardo says, to be seen, to see someone. As Courtney Baker, another one of my favorite humans in the world, talks about humane insight. Right. When you look at someone, when you see someone who is, and you have to make the decision, you have to choose that they are another being in the world who is worthy, as a judgment call, even, right? But people make that all the time, but you're not going to pass them by. I think in terms of thinking about pedagogies of love, it is the practice from the moment we step into a classroom, how we greet students. My greeting these days is amazing beings. I hope that you and the day are meeting each other well and gently. Right? I have learned such things, not to necessarily ask, how is your family? Having traveled and been in countries that are at war and have somebody respond to me to say, my family is dead, thank you so very much. So I find other ways to ask that. And so the practice of doing the work on a daily basis begins on the street, in fact, before we even enter our classroom. Because how we live, how we practice, how we breathe every day, right, for me, is how we enter that classroom, how we enter a meeting with our colleagues, when we are determined that we are going to speak and not be silent if we are in a position to do so, always recognizing everyone cannot at every time, right? But it doesn't begin there. It is a deeply deeply practice from the moment that we get up in the morning. And so I'm always asking people to think about who they are. But what do you do when you wake up in the morning? Right? And to bring that into class, because if I don't speak to my neighbor, how am I going to speak to my students? Right? If I run somebody over in the grocery store, to get the last rotisserie chicken at Sam's, right? What does that mean when I come to my classroom or a meeting or to speak up? So the practice of love, right? The practice of love, the hard practice of it is to make a commitment to not only do no harm, but to make space, to listen. And one of the practices to bear witness, right? To be willing to move ourselves out of the way and to listen to the person who is before us.
Thank you for that. Love, as Thich Nhat Hanh would say, love is one of those words that need to be healed. Words get sick and they need to be healed. And the word love needs to be healed, right? We're not talking about sentimentality or mush. We're talking about the complicated, daily, hourly, second by second practice of acknowledgement, respect, discipline, of seeing ourselves and our neighbor, right? The other thing about love is that if you can't love yourself, then that love goes out into the world very differently, right? What you think is love looks very different. And so there's a lot of internal work, which is what we're trying to do here at CMind, right? We are focused on internal transformation for external, right, results, for external transformation. The work of coming home to yourself is love. Now, some of us are homeless, right? Because perhaps we don't know love. Right? So those very complicated things, notions around love in a system. And again, I'm going back to this system thing because Paul asked about it in higher education. My solution for most things is let's blow it the hell up, right? Let's just set it on fire and blow it up, right? That's not always the right solution. I recognize that, and I don't do that often in practice, but that is the first place that I go to. But this notion of being a part of a system and not that you are the system is also this thinking that has to transform. Right? And if you want it to change, then you change. And it will change with it.
Dave, can I just say, I'm looking at the time for us too, this idea of blowing things up or taking a machete to things, I do want to know, when I think about healing from the perspective of as a healer and someone who does healing work, often I find that people have an idea of healing is that work gets done, practice gets done, and then everything gets better, right? And that's not necessarily the case. Right, the healing aspect of this, it really is a process in acknowledging what is happening, right, and also acknowledging, like, if we look at our institutions, our communities, and our systems as bodies, right, that oftentimes when an illness shows up physically in one's body, you have been sick for some time, but you have ignored. Right? You have ignored the information that you have been receiving, right? And so sometimes the healing comes, sometimes you have to remove a limb, right? In order for that healing of the rest of the body to happen, right? Sometimes it leads to very radical processes. And so for me, this idea of healing, sometimes for some faculty, that may mean that they have to leave, because once you begin doing that internal work and asking the questions, what does it mean to love, right? Thinking about Thich Nhat Hanh and the idea of what does a teacher do, right? That in order to be fully aware and awake to your own teaching, you have to do that internal work first. You have to be willing to do the reflection. And sometimes you discover that you are part of the system in a way that you need to remove yourself from it in order to do the other work. And that's why I think it will be interesting in 10, 15, 20 years to see what institutions have decided to do this work in a deeper level and what changes they make, right? What changes they make. But it doesn't mean that everything gets better. It is an ongoing, sort of like forgiveness, right? It is an ongoing practice. And that means that different people pick it up at different times, sometimes generationally. All right, so what do we do now? Now we can actually speak to each other and commit to supporting each other at meetings, with our students, in the street, on the bus, right? If any of y'all see me in your town, you're like, oh, I think you're so-and-so. I think I saw you before, right? Don't walk past me, right? That simple thing adjusts your life and it can save a life, right?
Thank you for that, Abu Gundy. So I'm gonna take us to this point, right? I joked with you all on our initial call that my grandmother, God rest her soul, would always say, don't give advice to people, right? Ask questions, don't give advice. But I'm going to ask you for your advice on behalf of everyone on the call tonight, right? Around any guidance or advice you have for us around practices of rest, rejuvenation, reclamation, and healing as we find ourselves potentially in a place where we're struggling with those things.
I tried to reflect on that, even when you asked that question in the handout, and it still is difficult to like think of advice because it's such a very important and deep request. But I can only speak from my experience, and I hope that my journey, my own development, could possibly help other faculty members who are needing that experience of pausing, as one of my research participants said. And one of the things that, and these are going to be very, I wish I can attach, theories or some groundbreaking author or whatever. But, part of this is, part of this journey in this question, at least in my interpretation, is sometimes you got to remove yourself from your identity and don't think about theory. Don't think about, some 18th century or, 20th century, whatever writer. Sometimes, part of having a journey is understanding how you define yourself. And so I guess that would be the first piece of advice as a faculty member, because this is what happened to me again in that very self-reflective moment of the highest career aspiration I ever had, compounded with a global pandemic, is to really ask myself, what is my vocation? And to use words like that, don't say, what is my work purpose, or what's my professional identity, or things like that. Really think about, like, some people call it vocation, your calling, whatever it is. Think about, really do some reflection on who are you at this moment. And I guess the other piece of advice I would say that comes from my my own personal journey is to allow yourself to become, I guess, to use the language that's used a lot in this, in this space, because I've learned what that word means and why there's a period after become, because, as writers, we want to add more to that. I want to become this, I want to become that. No, just put the period after become. And again, it's part of your self-reflection. And for me, I chose to think about something that's important to me, my own spiritual identity, to reconnect with that. And a student asked me this, by the way, last night in the honors class. she asked me, because I'm specifically studying Benedictine philosophy and how they see the world. And she asked me, she's like, so when did you decide like you want to study this order and attach yourself to it? And quite honestly, I told her, I don't know. I can't put a date. It just came to me. And so that would be my next piece of advice. Sometimes this will come to you if you allow it. And you may not remember when, you decide I'm going to change myself to become this more self-reflective professional faculty member. But you have to allow yourself that space for it to come to you. Because once you feel it, like I did, you'll take off with it. But I can't pinpoint when it happened. And I think that is that's how I feel this new part of myself in my professional identity occurred. I didn't plan it. I knew I wanted to do it, but it just came to me. Obviously, the pandemic happened and my tenure happened, but where it took off, I don't know. It's just something that it just came to me.
Mm-hmm. Trusting. One of the things when we met with David just to discuss this evening, I asked him, well, do I have to create a PowerPoint or something, or are we just going to come and talk? And so I was really grateful that we were just coming to talk and like that. So these are the things that I actually tell students and my colleagues. I want you to imagine, if you were to imagine how you want to spend the rest of your days, what would that look like? If you did not have to worry about money, if you did not have to worry about illness, if you did not have to worry about paying your mortgage, what other people thought about you, what would you do? Hi, what would you do? And I've actually said to graduate students, get your PhD and run away. Don't ever look back and come back here, because based on what you just told me, you don't even need to be here, but finish your degree, right? I also ask people to think about, in deep reflection, what do they love? And they often seems to be, these are like, very vague things, but to give a lot of thought to what brings you love and what brings you joy, right, on a daily basis. And what it is, and when you feel that you are at the limits, right? And when you have extended yourself. And I learned this very early as somebody who was a performing poet in Chicago. I looked up one evening, and on my large calendar I kept at the top of the stairs on the second floor, I had something every evening. And that meant that I was either out performing or out supporting my community. And I realized that I was tired because I was also working full time. And so I called literally the fourth and fifth people in the week. And I said, I'm so sorry, but I already have 3 other things on my calendar. And if it was not a paid gig, and if they had not already paid for a plane ticket, I said, here's the reason why I need to change, right? And everybody was really good with that. In your day-to-day life, on your calendars, right? Literally block out time on your calendar for you. I have a guideline. Fridays, I don't meet with people unless I'm taking a student to lunch. It's a particular project I'm working on, or I'm going to lunch with a colleague. Block it out, right? The Covey principle, the big things first. You're a big thing, right? Do that work first. But to really give yourself some time and some freedom to think about, what do you want to do on a daily basis? What do you want to do? Let that be your guide for what you love and how you show up every day. It is also a way not to allow yourself to get overwhelmed in the idea that there's nothing else you can do and that you're trapped, right? Because the moment you begin doing that, you also begin seeing some of the things that perhaps you would like to do. So you want to crochet, maybe it doesn't have to be this permanent thing, but you also begin to make ways. Maybe it's a weekend, maybe it's a week. The point is that you want to make a commitment that you will rest, right? Remembering that resting, and thinking about, the nap ministry, of course, but in just thinking about resting is not something that is optional. Your body and your mind and your spirit will fail if you do not rest. And then you will be good to no one, especially yourself. So begin to pay attention to the lines, the borders that mark for you when you are tired. Because by the time you were tired, because by the time you're thirsty, you're already dehydrated, right?
Mm-hmm.
So and don't do this alone. Ask someone who will walk with you to help you. Again, unlearn what the university teaches us, right? I'm a poet. You do stuff in community, right? Get someone. Matter of fact, look at who's here. If you can see names or something that somebody asked, and if you like it, go look them up and go ask them. You can find my email.
If I can add another thought too, and bear with me, this does sound quite deep and possibly scary. But when I first heard it, and again, this comes from some of the lessons that I heard from my my Benedictine monastery that I'm currently receiving teachings from in my oblate journey. And again, this is part of Saint Benedict's philosophy. Think about this. Every year, the anniversary of your death occurs. The anniversary of your death. And so they say that because consider every day between that day, you don't know yet, but it's there, how you're going to live your life. And one of the beautiful things that I learned from my lessons is this concept of dying a happy death. You don't want to go to bed angry, hopefully. You want to go to bed like knowing that I did good in this world. I helped that student. I had a good class. I don't want, I made a practice, and I don't do this quite well, but I do my best not to read my phone, like especially news, before going to bed, because if there's something that I read that makes me angry, I go to bed angry, and that's a bad feeling. And so this idea of what you do in your life is extremely important, especially as faculty members. And I every day I have a little wristband that I wear that reminds me every day of my current journey right now. What do I do each day that reminds me that if tomorrow should come and that should be the last day on this earth, what would be my legacy? And each day when I go to sleep, I try to go to sleep peaceful, knowing that I don't know what would happen overnight. It's really refreshing me in this very stressful faculty role to try to practice that. I don't do it well. That's why I'm a novice, and I have mentors in that part of myself. But I'm sure I'm damn trying to do it, and that's something I just wanted to add with that. I know it sounds a little scary, but think about it. It's actually quite beautiful, and it's quite joyful when you think about it.
Yeah, thank you for that, Rick. Thank you, Abu Gundy. I want to make some space in the last few minutes that we have together for any more questions and answers. I have Q&A. If anyone else has any questions, please drop those in the Q&A. I think what really stuck out to me from both of your comments, right, as we begin to bring ourselves to a close, is that this reliance and this understanding that we can do nothing alone, that all of this work is together work, it's community work. The other is that, as Maya Angelou would say, all virtues and vices start at home and spread abroad. Right? If you are not doing these practices in your daily life, which is where they start, right, then the practice has not yet become the way for you. That is what I'm picking up here, right? And the other is to touch your purpose, right? And purpose, for me, is transformative. It meets us at whatever moment we are in our life, right? And it makes room for us to do the work that we need to do, whatever that work may be, or just being. Forget the work. Let's do away with labor. Doesn't take work. But whatever we are called to be in that moment, purpose makes room for us, right? And that we can do none of it without love. We can do none of it without love. That healing is actually, this notion of healing is actually saturated in love, in profound love for ourselves, for the planet, for others. And that without it, perhaps, we may not ever get to a healed place. And I don't know, honestly, it is a process, and it may be an ongoing process, right? And it may be a process in healing in the way that we're talking about it that may not come in the ways we think it will come, or look like how we think it's going to look, right? But you'll know it when you see it. You will know it when you see it. I am going to ask of you one final question. Right? Now, Abu Gundy, you started getting to this in your remarks, right? But my question is around imagining. Right? A lot of my work outside of CMind is around the imagination. And I go to Toni Morrison often for this. And she wrote in Beloved that the only grace you can have is the grace you can imagine. If you cannot imagine it, you cannot have it. So what are you imagining for your respective environments, for your respective campuses, for your colleagues and friends, maybe even perhaps for the system? So to say this in another way, what might healing look like, feel like, taste like, smell like for you in this moment?
I am reading Lisa Marie's question. For those in the academy who don't have familiarity, comfort, or skill to do the important inner work, how can we best support them and open the door for them? They have a different imprint that is hard to penetrate. And so for me, I am imagining a place for those of us who do the work and who are able to do the work, that we have open doors and open hearts, that we actually develop an ability to listen. My senior colleague and I, in my department, we greet each other every morning with a dance. I'm like, let's do this, right? I imagine that we are free to dance with each other down the hallways as a way to invite people into a circle. And I imagine that there are rooms and spaces on our campuses where if people need to cry, they can come and cry, or they can sleep, right? Sometimes I've offered sleeping places for people and meditation spaces for people. I imagine that we do not have to discuss the complicated nature of love in the academy, because so many of us do work that we say we love, but we have these tensions between it, but that language does not continue to be the barrier between us, right? That we actually, as my students were talking today, if we could live in an all Black world, what would that look like? And we talked about vibration, right? That we would be able to make space and sense one another in a way that does not require us to use the limits of language.
Two words popped up in my head immediately, and these are concepts that I'm studying just for me to try to understand. I would envision my environments, my respective campus, to see faculty staff, administrators, and students with a sense of humility. We are not perfect. We make mistakes, and when we make mistakes, we shouldn't be, we shouldn't be made less than. Especially coming out of the pandemic, and especially for me, I'm the first gen. I have this phrase, I'm first gen all over again. I'm the first one in my extended family, cousins included, that has reached this tenure status for something called a professor. I don't know. I make mistakes sometimes, and we need institutions to value humility and value when we do make a mistake. And what I mean by that is to pick us up, to uplift us, to let us know that we're going to continue. Your era isn't the end of our university. But I think sometimes our administrators, they let us know that your mistake is ending our university. And that's not how you treat humans, in my opinion. We are not perfect. And so humility. And then hospitality. In my teaching, my students know my classrooms are spaces where they are welcome. And I think sometimes higher education institutions forget that we are institutions that should embrace hospitality. But again, some of my colleagues, they don't want hospitality in their spaces. And I wish we would have more of that.
Thank you for that. Rick, Abegunde, wow. Thank you both for a wonderful conversation that fed my soul today, and gave me a different and deeper understanding of what it means to heal, right? Of what it means to embody the institution by embodying our very beings in community with one another. Before I close, please be reminded, audience, to take our survey that will drop in the chat. And if you have your credit cards handy, let me say that again. If you have your credit cards handy and are able, we would welcome a donation to CMind to keep these programs and our work going. I want to thank the wonderful audience members who have joined us tonight. We hope to see you next week, Thursday, April 7th, for Healing Higher Ed, Reimagining Contemplative Practices at the Community College with Marlon Blake, Stephanie Briggs, and Amy Puccino. What I am sitting with as we leave tonight is, in the words of our newly initiated ancestor, Bell Hooks, the classroom remains the most radical space of possibility. I think she would add that so do all of us. If we can imagine it, we can have it. Right? We are radical possibility in motion. And that brings me great joy. Great, great joy. I wish for each of you rest. I wish breath. I wish for you the space to cry and sob, or to walk and run, to imagine and to pray. We are here. And we sure as hell ain't going nowhere no time soon. Until next time, be well, be still, trust in the infinite, remember our shared humanity, be community, and please be of good courage. Good night.